Yeah, Mr. Robertson, today is the opening day for the 31st ASEAN Summit. We haven't seen or heard about human rights issue mentioned in the forum or in the summit. What do you think about it?
Well, the problem is that the rights-abusing governments like Cambodia, Vietnam, and others are going to veto any sort of discussion about human rights. ASEAN still functions by the archaic rule that one country can veto any sort of discussion or topic. And I think that's what we're going to see again and again and again until they change that rule. You know, we're dealing with a ASEAN summit headed by a person, Rodrigo Duterte, who certainly has serious problems with human rights of his own. And so he's certainly not going to call out Hun Sen. And, unfortunately, this is the way ASEAN works. ASEAN is all about the things that matter to the government leaders and the big business people, but it's not about the things that matter to the little people, the villagers, the people who've lost their land, the women who have been raped and abused, the others who have faced serious violations of their rights.
Mm-hmm. So President Trump yesterday and Prime Minister Hun Sen briefly met during the dinner time. So hopefully they talked about human rights, or what do you think about that?
I don't think that either of them know the word human rights except in a phrase full of swears. You know, unfortunately, I think the situation is that Donald Trump is not prepared to raise human rights issues with anyone. He doesn't care about these issues, and he has continually showed a failure to uphold the previous bipartisan consensus that human rights is a core part of U.S. foreign policy. In this way, he is unlike any president that we've had in the modern era. He is someone who has essentially discarded a core part of what U.S. Foreign policy has meant over the years, that there is an expression of values, and the values include human rights issues. So, Hun Sen and his people now in Phnom Penh are busy pushing out the line that no one cares about the CNRP, and Hun Sen has been received very well at ASEAN and APEC, and so, this means that everybody accepts Hun Sen. And I think that Hun Sen is fooling himself if he thinks that getting a photo with Donald Trump means anything. Hun Sen and Donald Trump probably have about the same level of approval ratings amongst their people, and it's quite low. And I think that we're seeing a situation where with Donald Trump endorsing Hun Sen through a photo, that's not meaningful to Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump even knew where Cambodia was 2 months ago. I mean, he doesn't have any properties. He doesn't have a Trump Tower there. Why would he ever pay any attention? If push comes to shove, if the Congress, both the Democrats and the Republicans, decide to press on Cambodia, I don't think Donald Trump's going to rush to Hun Sen's rescue.
So what happened to the human rights situation in Cambodia later? Because there's many human rights issue abused in the region. So if Donald Trump and other world leaders don't talk about that, so what's going to happen then?
Well, we're working to make sure they do talk about this. I think there are world leaders who are prepared to talk about human rights. Members of the European Union who, of course, are not at these meetings, but also, the governments of New Zealand, governments of South Korea, governments of other countries, certainly in the APEC bloc, who care about human rights. So it's not uniform. But what we see within ASEAN is that ASEAN is a club of rights-abusing dictators. And this is, again, true to form, that they are ignoring human rights because it is convenient for them to do so, and they all have a problem. And they're all playing the game that if you talk about what I'm doing, then I'll have to talk about what you're doing. So it's a sort of a ceasefire that no one agrees to talk about human rights because everybody has a problem. With Hun Sen, though, I mean, the situation in Cambodia is going to rocket to the top of the agenda in ASEAN if he goes through with this blatantly political effort to dissolve the CNRP on bogus claims against Kem Sokha that there's a color revolution. I mean, this is something that they're just making up as an excuse to crack down on human rights. And if that dissolution goes forward on the 16th of November, which we're worried about, then I think there will be worldwide condemnation of Cambodia, and that will kick off a new step in a campaign to try to get the international community paying greater attention on the issue of human rights in Cambodia.
So what happened to Cambodian government official? Because like you mentioned about condemnation or some kind of sanctions, mostly people in the U.S. like congressmen, they mentioned about the sanctions like economic sanctions or political sanctions. So what do you expect to see later then?
Well, Hun Sen should reflect on the fact that he doesn't really have any friends on Capitol Hill. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats are friendly towards him or towards his government, in part because they have been seen as violating human rights for decades. So what I expect there will be a identification of senior political and military leaders of Cambodia, and that these people will then face sanctions, including possibly being placed on the SDN list, the Specially Designated Nationals list, which is a list that would be connected to travel restrictions and financial restrictions on individuals, and also possibly the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a standalone law that came into effect last year in the United States, which has not been used that much, but is also another avenue for sanctions that would be targeted sanctions. We're also hearing that the European Union is considering issues connected to GSP and GSP+. The Canadian government is busy passing a Global Magnitsky Act similar to the one that the U.S. already has. So I think that there's going to be a lot of possibilities that Hun Sen is going to find that if he goes through with this dissolution and he continues with his crackdown, there is going to be a major international reaction that will include specifically targeted sanctions against him, his family, and the other top leaders of the CPP and the armed forces of Cambodia.
Do you think they care about the sanctions against them? I mean, government officials or Prime Minister Hun Sen family, like you mentioned?
Well, I think they do, and I'll explain why. First of all, these sanctions will make it very difficult for them to do business with any entity that has connections with the U.S. financial system, because the U.S. banks are affected. So, for instance, if they put their money in Singapore, and Singapore bank also has connections with the United States, that bank has to choose between doing business with the United States or doing business with this Cambodian general, for instance. So, that will impact them. And, the other fact is that many people in Cambodia have relatives living overseas. They have them living in the United States. Many of them want to send their children to U.S. universities. And, that may also be a problem if you're a member of a family that has been sanctioned, because, those travel sanctions will presumably also include key members of the family. So, they may have to explain to the son, like, I know you wanted to go to UCLA, but I'm sorry, you can't, because Dad made a mistake.
The ASEAN community or ASEAN leaders may raise only the issue of human rights, partly about human trafficking. Do you think that's enough, or should they expand more issue about human rights in the region?
Well, I think human trafficking is the beginning of a discussion that they need to have, but it has to go beyond that. Fortunately, we're finally going to see some action on the rights of migrant workers. There's going to be a actual resolution passed and proclaimed by the ASEAN this year about protecting and promoting the rights of migrant workers. We have to see what is in that. The text is still secret, but the Philippines and Indonesia and others have been pushing very hard for a resolution. And Cambodia should also support that, because when Cambodian workers are going overseas, whether they be maids going to Malaysia or whether they construction workers going to South Korea, they're facing rights abuses. They're facing being cheated by these recruitment firms. They're facing debt bondage. They're facing sometimes enslavement, and they don't have rights to be able to defend themselves. And the Cambodian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is completely useless when it comes to helping migrant workers overseas from Cambodia. They're part of the problem, frankly. A lot of times they're the ones who are involved, perhaps, in some of this dirty procurement in terms of like sending people overseas through the recruitment agencies. So I think that now that we're getting to an issue of like migrant workers, which is much broader than just a small group of trafficking victims, we may see something. But the problem is still going to be the same one I talked about at the beginning, which is that there is this non-interference in internal affairs edict, which continues within ASEAN. And so if it gets uncomfortable for any one government, they can just put their hand up and say, you know what, we don't want to talk about this. And that issue just goes right off the agenda, and that's that.
So what do you think today that all the NGOs from the 10, 11 countries, they comes to talk about human rights, talk about people's life in the region, and then they are planning to submit some kind of recommendations to ASEAN leaders. Do they care about them, or what sort of actions the ASEAN leaders should do and to solve the problem with the people here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's very important that we have this ASEAN People's Forum to reflect the real voices of the people of ASEAN and the people in the civil society, the community voices, because those voices are not heard by their governments in many cases. So by coming together and working together, they have a bigger voice. And, you know, this is a huge turnout here. We have maybe 800 people from, as you said, 11 countries. It's very important that, you know, the governments understand that the statement that they are producing and that they're going to put forward is something that the government should look at closely, they should examine, and they should basically call for the necessary action to meet the demands of the people. ASEAN keeps saying that it is a people's ASEAN. You know, this is for the people of ASEAN, but they don't prove it. They never actually act that way. And it's time that the ASEAN and their leaders start changing the way they work and start really representing the interests of the ASEAN people and not just their own interests and the interests of the crony capitalists around them.
Thank you, Mr. Phil Robertson of Human Rights Watch, that's allowing VOA to interview you.
Thank you. Okun Charan.